Welcome to the History of Retina's Leaders and Legends series. The purpose of these interviews is to capture first-hand stories from individuals with unique retinal insights of historical significance. Through these discussions, we hope to provide a fuller understanding of the evolution of both the science and practice of retina through the lens of those individuals who have actually lived it. It is my great honor to be joined today by Dr. Emily Chu. Dr. Chu is Director of the Division of Epidemiology and Clinical Applications and Deputy Clinical Director of the National Eye Institute. She is also a Senior Investigator and Chief of the Anti-Eyes Clinical Trials Branch. A true trailblazer, Emily has forged a remarkable path. Born in Canton, China, her family emigrated to Canada, where she attended the University of British Columbia and pursued her medical degree in ophthalmology training at the University of Toronto. Dr. Chu completed fellowships in medical retina and genetics at the Wilmer Eye Institute and furthered her training in the Netherlands. Dr. Chu brings a myriad of fascinating experiences and perspectives as a first-generation American who has blazed a trail for women in the field while building a stellar career at one of the world's leading health agencies. She works with renowned experts across the globe, and her groundbreaking research has changed the treatment paradigms for our patients and for a variety of significant retinal diseases. Dr. Chu has worked on some of our field's most pivotal multi-centered clinical trials, including the early treatment diabetic retinopathy study. She chaired the age-related eye disease study, both AREDS 1 and 2, and she directs the clinical portion of the International Macular Telangiectasia Project. As you might expect, she has received numerous honors for her work, having published over 500 papers, 21 editorials, and 30 book chapters, along with sharing her findings extensively with audiences both nationally and internationally. I am truly pleased to welcome Dr. Emily Chu. So Dr. Chu, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your story today.
Thank you for having me.
Really a pleasure. So let's go back. Your entry into North America is a little bit unique. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. I was a young child when my parents brought me to Vancouver Island, where I grew up. My parents immigrated from China, and my grandfather had already been here, and it was just part of the whole process of bringing the rest of the family here. So I went to school in a very small town called Duncan, British Columbia, where we would ride our bicycles, and we didn't have to lock up anything. You leave it in the door, and you walk in, and it was an idyllic place to live. It was a wonderful place to grow up.
Did you speak English when you came?
No, I remember learning to speak English. I was very young. I was probably almost 6 years old. I remember very distinctly learning how to speak English.
I think that's kind of amazing to come into North America, acquire the language, and then have the story that you have to tell us. So where did your interest in medicine begin?
I think really in high school, trying to determine what kind of work I would do. And at one point, I thought I'd become a pharmacist, and I learned that they just count pills. And I thought, that's not going to be fun for me. I had a real love for science, and my teachers said, well, you might think of medicine. And my father always wanted to be a physician, but he didn't have the opportunity. And 3 out of our 4 siblings are all physicians, I think partly because of his influence. So
where were you in medical school?
So I did 1 year of university at British Columbia, my undergraduate. I transferred to University of Toronto because I wanted to go to a bigger school. I wanted to learn more about a big city. And I found out you have a 6-year program, so I applied after my 2nd year, and I went to University of Toronto for my medical school. And I did my residency there as well, too.
What drives you into ophthalmology?
Oh, it's a wonderful story. I was a medical student, and we always like free food. So I was at a party, and my urology supervisor, Dr. Michael Jewett, said, you must come to a party and meet my wife. I'm like, okay, sure. And it was free food, so I go, and Brenda Galley, who is the world expert on retinoblastoma, as you well know, since it's your field, says to me, you should do ophthalmology. You got to come and spend some time with me. So I said, okay, I could do that. And I did, and that changed my life because, she was a very energetic and just a charismatic person. And she had so much fun doing what she was doing. And she always said to me, it's so important to do research because it impacts many more people at once and rather than one-on-one, just clinical care. And she clearly loved what she was doing, and I really got interested in it. And that was a wonderful year. We worked on projects that eventually got me to ARVO. ARVO is a very transforming experience.
Especially in those days.
In those days, particularly, it was very intimate, small groups. And I really enjoyed it. And I met a lot of different people. And that sort of stimulated my interest in research as well. And so all these mentorships are really important.
Now, that gets you into an interest in ophthalmology and with Brenda and really a focus on science. Take me to your next step.
So the residency was interesting. I was one of 6 residents. I was the only female. And then the year before me was 2 women were in it. And one of my very good friends was also very instrumental in mentoring me as well. And there were good mentors in terms of what you would do next. And so that was a very interesting experience. And the first time when I was actually interviewed, my chair said to me, how's your housekeeping? I go, my housekeeping? I said, it's pretty darn good. I'm a pretty good cook. What is it you need? So this is sort of thing that we're coming up with. And he says, well, those guys are pretty darn good. You got to be very good. I said, well, I'll certainly try, So that's sort of the attitude we're going into. And so it was a very different era. But nevertheless, I had good mentors who interested me in retina. And so that's what I ended up doing. And my chair was very interested in getting me to the right place. He suggested I go to do a fellowship in Holland, and I did. And at Wilmer, where I met 2 wonderful mentors, actually many mentors there, and ended up getting really interested in clinical research because that's when we started doing the macular photocoagulation study, the MPS study, and the ETDRS, the diabetic retinopathy study. And so it was thrilling.
So who were your Hopkins mentors, and about when was that?
That'd be in the 1980s, and Dr. Arnold Patz was the chair, and he was just a charming man. He made you feel like you were the center of attention no matter what. And Stuart Fine was the head of the RVC, Retinopathy Center, so he was very instrumental. And of course, Bob Murphy was one of my teachers, and I ended up marrying him. So, it's I don't think you marry fellows anymore these days. So
it's a little rare.
It's a little rare. And of course, Dan Finkelstein was there as well. And then there was a number of other people. He did public health, like Al Summer, who's remained good friends, and Hugh Taylor, who's, did a lot of global health work. And of course, Maureen McGuire, who was really an instrumental statistician. She was outstanding. So it was the beginning of the clinical trials that was so important for ophthalmology.
And you're right there at the sort of the groundwork being laid for clinical trials with probably one of the best groups in the world to develop that.
Was very motivating and very, very incredibly inspirational.
It's hard when you're at Hopkins ever to leave Hopkins, has been my experience. So tell me how we get you along on your next step in your journey.
I went back to University of Toronto and worked there for a couple of years. And meanwhile, I had plans to come back and to the States, and I was offered a job both at Hopkins at the National Eye Institute. And I thought, well, Bob was already at Hopkins, and I thought, I probably shouldn't work at the same place as a spouse. It's a little easier, if something goes on and it's good, it's fine, but if it's not good, then people get blamed. I don't want to be part of that. So I ended up picking the National Eye Institute because Rick Ferris was one of my good mentors and great friend, was going to teach me a lot about clinical trials, and the whole group was doing clinical trials on a different level. And I thought, well, I could learn something. Maybe I'll go back to academics after that. But I've been there now for decades, so it turned out to be a really good move to be there.
Well, I think that the way that we see the National Institute now is very different from when you went. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Well, I think the National Institute was often a very good start with Dr. Kupfer. He was a founding member, and he started the Diabetic Retinopathy study, DRS, which was, he had a particular interest in public health and in clinical trials. So our division really thrived. We had a huge number of statisticians, epidemiologists, and clinical trialists, and very few clinicians. And then when I got there, we did more clinical work, and we expanded the clinical trials, and we went from diabetic retinopathy to age-related macular degeneration. So those two trials, the AREDS and AREDS 2, sort of came into being, and those were two big learning experiences for me to learn from those. And of course, we did some more diabetic studies. We collaborate with other institutes, so that came to be. So I think the focuses might have changed from that point of view, but the core is still there. And of course, we're only the intramural program, which is only 10%. You get grants from the extramural program, which is really more than 80% of the funding.
And one of the things that I've always been impressed with is you've always, to me, had a long-term strategic vision. You didn't just look at short questions. You asked some big questions that were going to take a long time to answer. So how were you able to do that?
I think as part of being an intramural program, we had continuous funding, and we kind of said, we're going to do this trial for 5 years. When we finished the 5 years, so we need funding for another 5 years, because this is like watching your grass grow. It's a very slow process. These are chronic diseases. So we ended up getting funding for AREDS 1 and AREDS 2. AREDS 1 in particular, 10 years of really long-term follow-up with fundus photographs, eye exams, and we follow over almost 5,000 patients, which is unheard of. And our follow-up rate was remarkable. We had very small loss to follow-up. It was the days when we had very dedicated investigators, dedicated coordinators. You were part of that in Miami. People were really, really involved. So it was amazing, really, truly amazing. So,
and I think that data continues to guide us going forward. So it's not just that it was this one study. It seems like you've been able to mine that, as a treasure trove of information.
It's like a gift that keeps giving. It's amazing. So we started with the clinical trial. We learned that there were A's better than B, so that vitamins really did work, minerals did work, it reduced the risk of macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of blindness. If you can take something that can reduce the risk going to late disease, that's quite remarkable. We estimated about 300,000 people were saved from having macular degeneration because of that over a period of 5 years. But then we learned later that the diet was really important. Diet was very important and very few people understand that. We don't get taught that in medical school. So the Mediterranean diet is important in reducing the risk of macular degeneration. After the first study, we realized that we needed to study something else, because when we look at the diet, we found that people eating green leafy vegetables were much more protected, and also fish. But green leafy vegetables, you have to eat it, and this thing called lutein zeaxanthin was never tested in macular degeneration for AREDS 1 because it wasn't available commercially. So AREDS 2 came along. We designed that to specifically look at that because fish was really important. So we can give them omega-3 fatty acids. Right. And all the studies were going on. It's good for your cardiovascular disease. It's good for your brain. We must take it. So interestingly, omega-3 fatty acids wasn't good for your brain, your heart, or your eye. It was negative, unfortunately. That would be nice to fix, But lutein was really good.
And then, you've also been able to look at some pretty rare diseases. So here we go from the most common disease, macular degeneration, and the impact is huge. Tell me a little bit about MacTel, which has also been a passion of yours.
In 2003, December, I was asked to see a patient because I wrote about it as a fellow, not because I knew anything more about it, but you wrote about this stuff. Why don't you go see this patient? And this patient came, and I confirmed the patient had macular telangiectasia. He'd come from Australia. And he says, well, his father says, do you do research in this? I said, I do research, but mostly in common diseases, public health issues. But this is a more rare condition, so we don't put this much money into it from the government. He says, well, how much will it take? I said, probably millions. He said, well, how many millions? I said, lots of millions. And he said, okay. And they come back a month later and they call me and said, we'd like you to head off the clinical part of this because we're going to do a study. And I go, okay. It turns out this gentleman had
lots of millions,
had a lot of resources, but had a big heart, had a huge heart, and really felt that it was their responsibility with their resources that they had to contribute back, which was a wonderful thing. And so within a year, we had a big meeting in Baltimore to start this off. And I asked them, we can do a clinical trial to come along, but we don't know what to study because we don't know anything about the disease. So can we do a natural history study? He said, sure, go ahead. And, those are expensive, as you know. We actually follow almost 1,700 patients and eventually got into a clinical trial. But we learned from that study what was important in the eye, what's important to the patient, what can we study that we can measure and see change. So that's a very special part. The outcome measurement is really very important. We had no outcome measurements. We were also lucky because technology involved. OCT came into being. It really helped us look at the structure function changes. And some of the retinal sensitivities we can measure with the microperimetry, and things really became very obvious to us what we could do. But it was an incredible collaboration. We had 22 clinics that were in 7 different countries. It was really international effort. We discovered that it wasn't just a vascular disease. Dr. Don Gass, this was his from Miami. That was his big baby. He described it all, and he gave us really wonderful information. But he didn't have the technology that we had. So that really changed everything. It was a game changer. And our clinicians and basic science talk to each other quite a bit and discover that it's probably a neurovascular disease, neurovascular glial degeneration, and decided that one thing that might be important, based on animal models and based on some of the outer retinal degeneration you see in other animal models, that ciliary neurotrophic factor, CNTF, would be very important. And so we did one phase 1 study, was pretty safe, and a phase 2 study with 99 eyes. And we found that it was actually significantly effective in reducing the risk of losing the photoreceptors over time. And with that, we said, well, we're going to do a phase 3 study. So 19 years later, we have 2 phase 3 studies, and we have now a treatment that's effective for macular telangiectasia.
Right. And a novel treatment, this encapsulated cell technology, very different than every other approach that we'd explored.
So not injections, not by mouth, but you actually insert something, surgically with a small cut, and then you suture it in. And these are genetically engineered cells, the RPE cells, that are put in a tiny little implant that is really, really teeny tiny, and is elaborating these factors all the time. We've removed them now 10 years later, and it's still elaborating the same factors.
One of the other diseases that you and I have overlapped with has been von Hippel-Lindau disease. And it tells a good part of the same type of remarkable story.
Well, you and I have had a lot of experience where we've had lots of patients that you and I share who really, we had no treatment for them. And, von Hippel-Lindau's disease being a rare disease, 1 in 36,000 live births is pretty rare. And these patients get brain tumors, eye tumors, tumors in their kidney and reproductive systems, and endocrine, their pancreas. It's a disaster. And if they have it all, it's I don't even know how they would go through the day. These are remarkably courageous patients, for sure. So you and I have worked on this for a long time. We've looked at patients. We've done all the treatment we can do to destroy the tumors if they're small enough. But when they're on the optic nerve, that's like a kiss of death, unless you can stop it. And it's unstoppable for most cases, as you and I have had. We've shared cases where they go blind. So it's heartbreaking. But this past couple of years, it's been a joy because we did this clinical trial. We did actually 4 years ago, we started doing phase 1, phase 2 trial. Even with the phase 2 trial, which looked at patients that were not a huge number, we were able to show that the kidney cancer and the brain cancer responded so well. And in our small sub-study of patients with eye disease, every tumor regressed. Every tumor got smaller. And patients, did not lose vision. And those optic nerve tumors, we know when we stopped it, it kind of came back a little bit. But those very large tumors elsewhere, we were able to stop it and then apply laser or cryo. It's a game changer. So we are very, very, very lucky to have these collaborations, to be able to working with each other and finding what's best for our patients. And I mean, I'm just over the moon that we have something terrific for our patients.
Those are the moments that just kind of touch you and I in ways that are unique. You get chills. You're like, you look at that tumor getting smaller in the eye and you're like, it's amazing.
I had a patient I treat from Canada, and she lives in the very north part of Canada, and she says to me, in 1 week, my vision improved. She says, I cannot believe this. And I was ready to go down the road. It was her only eye. Her other eye had already been affected. And she was, I was just crying, you know. When she told me, I started to cry myself. It's amazing, you know.
It's amazing. And then, you know, the other thing is that you've really alluded to the fact that this is continuous change for us. So we're entering into this incredible opportunity of artificial intelligence, which all of us are excited about, and none of us quite know what to
do with
expect.
it yet. Right.
I think that's where you and your team will play a big role going forward. Could you tell me a little bit about how that's going to go?
So artificial intelligence, again, going back to AREDS, which is a gift that keeps on giving. You know, we have 8,000 people followed for 10 years on these fundus photographs. We can predict, looking at those photographs, who's going to progress, you know, over time. And so can you then say, we're going to be more aggressive with this person, or I'm going to follow this person a little more carefully, or this person might be better off picking this treatment because you know that. You can also predict who's going to get cardiovascular disease or cognitive function decline. Not that we can do much about it. Maybe we can in the future, but that's something that's really, really exciting. So how do we incorporate it into our care? I mean, just basic things like detecting disease, looking at prognosis, that could be very important. The FDA has been really involved with this, and we've been working in a group called the Collaborative Community for Ophthalmic Imaging. So we're using images to do all this work. The question is, how do we implement it into healthcare, and how do we do that? And these things have to be validated, validation, not only just in a small group, but very diverse group of people. You know, again, equity for all of us, a diverse group of patients who are different ages and different gender and different races, and whether, you know, does it work in one and not the other. You don't want to be working on things that become just one group and you apply to somewhere else. It might be biased. It might be actually harmful. So we have to learn about things like that. We're really in for a really interesting ride. I think it's going to be very exciting.
You know, you're like a force of nature. So tell me a little bit about the journey where you start, and very few women are here to now where I think of you as a national and international mentor for women in medicine.
When I was in medical school, I wasn't sure how I would actually lead my life, because there were many women who were there, like people who did the retinopathy prematurity. The neonatologists were women who often were not married. They just basically had to be very focused on their career, and I didn't know I want to do that. I really wanted to have a family, and actually I wanted to be a pediatrician when I first started. I thought I love kids, and is that going to be possible? And I see that there were very few role models. You know, Brenda Galley was one, you know, but she had a very supportive husband. So I think we need men as allies to support the women to do this work. And you have to have a voice. You have to speak up when you think it has to be done. So, for example, it turns out that we found out Chi Chao Chan, whom you know, is a pathologist, a wonderful pathologist who was a fellow with me at Wilmer. We both ended up at National Eye Institute, and we were one of the two women who were actually at very early on. We discovered that our salaries were lower than the men. When we, you know, there was this bonus you get, and men got $19,000, we got $1,000. I mean, it's not a lot of money, but in the end, when you're 20 years later and you look at the actual pension, that could be a lot of money, you know.
And isn't it not even about the money?
It's not even about the money. It's
Right.
not even about money. It's just being recognition.
It's
the
just
fact that, you know,
right.
we over and over again, data have shown that if you have diversity, having men and women, having diverse cultures, you do better. You're more productive both in business and in scientific discoveries. That's also better too. There's actually good data showing that. But still, for the last 3 decades at the NIH, women PI or their principal investigators who have their own budget, 27% are women, and has remained so for decades. Like, why can't we move that needle? Why can't we do that? When you look up even higher up into the leadership roles, that's even much smaller. And that's true of all academic places as well.
Emily, one of the things that's always been important to you has been this concept of mentorship. And you've had a unique career path. I mean, not many of us have tracked into government. What do you do with your young doctors?
So it's interesting that government doesn't have a residency program, but we have a fellowship program. But we have a very unique medical school program where it's called Medical Research Scholars Program. So medical students actually pause for a year and come and spend a year with us. And that's very transforming for some of them. They really are cream of the crop students, and they obviously want to do research. So we try to simulate that bug to be a clinician scientist, to be really interested and curious. And then we have clinical fellows that we've had for 20 years, and they're remarkable. Some of them come for 2 years. Our program is pretty flexible. It's the clinical aspect, but we want to teach them clinical research. We want them to have a love for clinical research. And some of them have gone on to work in clinical research work, not necessarily always. But I've had people who finish fellowships and decided they have to go home because there's certain things they need to do. But years later, they come back to academics because they realize how important it is. So we've had 3 fellows who've done that, who started off in private practice and now are in full academics. So I like to think that we have had some influence in showing them that is really an important part of life, that they give back, and that's all part of it.
You don't seem to be slowing down at all. So we have you for the next couple of decades. What's that going to look like for you?
Macular degeneration is the leading cause of blindness in the United States and in high-income countries. So a lot of people are affected. 288 million people are going to be affected in the next decade. That's worldwide. That's huge. So AI work's going to be really important on how to detect it, how to do treatment really early. And prevention at the early stage, so they don't get down to the end where you're injecting, drugs and coming in every month. But if we can do that, so my dream is to be able to find a prevention for that group and looking at the natural history of those early diseases.
Well, Dr. Chu, thank you so much for talking with us today. Really an enjoyable conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was great being here with you.